morning what state I am even in, much less what my wife is telling me. So sometimes I have to kind of get a little bit of extra coffee in my system so I can have a clue about what's actually going on around me at 7:30 in the morning. So good morning to all of you. It is about 11:30 and your pastor is awake at this point. You know, it's easy to say that we trust in Jesus when things go well. It's a lot more difficult to say I trust Jesus when all of a sudden life throws a curveball at you. I can't help but think back at all of the people who have given their lives for Christ as I come to this passage today. The people who were faced with that decision: deny Christ and live, or die. There's been multiple stories that have been put out there of people in this day and age in different countries around the world who have had a gun pointed to their heads, and they tell them, do you deny Christ or do you die? And they are faced with that decision right there. Do I trust enough in Jesus to be able to die? Today we come to this passage right here where Jesus is on a boat with his disciples. We start today in Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 22. One day Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." So they got into a boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." He got up and he rebuked the wind and the raging waters, and the storm subsided and all was calm. "Where is your faith?" he asked his disciples. In fear and amazement, they asked one another, "Who is this? He commands even the winds and the waters, and they obey him." So once again, Jesus is with his disciples, and he is teaching them somewhere in the Sea of Galilee area, possibly around Capernaum once again, but still with his disciples, teaching them about how to be his apostles, his representatives. Jesus teaching his disciples once again. But today we're going to see an example of him teaching them by showing them. We begin once again today around the Sea of Galilee. Now we remember that the Sea of Galilee is a giant lake. It's not some small lake. This is a sea where fishermen went in boats and went out fishing. We have that picture, Marvin? There we go. So we have the Sea of Galilee right there. And this is actually what a boat, back then, this is a model of what a boat would look like during their time. Their main industry, a lot of these little towns around the Sea of Galilee, was fishing. They were fishermen, especially around the Capernaum area. And now you see the sea. This is actually a picture looking out towards the Golan Heights, around where Capernaum actually is. And we see the high rock walls that go around the side. Some valleys, but a lot of hills around it. Around Capernaum and Tiberias, there are actually hills that go up both sides. And Jesus was around this area where he did a lot of his ministry. And we see that, but Luke goes into a change of direction here with what he's talking about. We learned last week about the response that people need to have to the Word, specifically the people's loyalty to God and His Word first. And this loyalty trumps all other loyalties. But we shift back to the Sea of Galilee today, where we take a look at what faith, again, really looks like and what trust really looks like. The conditions on the Sea of Galilee depended a lot on the weather, because what actually happens around there depends a lot on not only the weather, but the hills, as you see. Because what has happened in the past and what happens now is when a storm blows in, the wind goes down the hills and into the sea. So it actually, when the wind converges onto the sea, it brings up these giant waves. Sometimes, as it's described by fishermen who are still on the sea, sometimes the waves can get as high as 11 and 12 feet in the middle of this sea. So actually at some point, it would be quite dangerous for fishermen, depending on how the weather would go. We have to think for a second about being out in a boat like this when you have to deal with 11 and 12-foot waves. So if there's a storm coming, you could be in some very dangerous conditions. Now, the boats were made of cedar wood, very strong boats, but boats that would not last in a giant storm, especially when you're dealing with multiple people and supplies in one of these boats. Now, Jesus was still teaching them and teaching his disciples, but one day Jesus says to his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. We're not given any reason why Jesus would want to go to the other side of the sea. And we have to ask, why would Jesus want to go all of a sudden go to the other side of the lake? What's the point? Why is Jesus, when he's having a good ministry in Capernaum, all of a sudden want to go across the lake, across the sea to Tiberias? Jesus wanted to go to the other side of the lake. And so he just told his disciples, the ones who know how to fish, the ones who know the area, the ones who have sailed in this area before, who know how to traverse the Sea of Galilee, they know how to get across safely. He tells them, get the boat, let's go to the other side. We might not know why Jesus wants to go to the other side of the lake, but here's something we need to remember. Jesus knows what's going on here. Jesus knows why he's sending them out, why he's sending himself out to the lake on this day of all days. Because Jesus knows he's going to use this as a teaching moment. We remember, Jesus knows what is going to happen. Jesus, being who he is, knows what's coming. We and the disciples at this point in the story don't know why Jesus wants to go to the other side of the lake all of a sudden. Seems out of the blue. But Jesus knows what he's doing. And Jesus knows what's coming. And he knows exactly what's going to happen during this day. Jesus knows what is coming. And he's going to use this as an opportunity to teach his disciples. So the disciples do what Jesus says. They went and they found the boat and they start packing. And they would pack these boats so that they could get to the other side with supplies. So it would put a lot more weight into the boat. Now what happens when you put a lot of weight into a boat, especially when you get more and more people into a boat and you take it out to the water? The boat starts to go under into the water a little bit more. So you have to be careful. A lot of you guys who know how to pack boats, you have to be careful with what you're putting into the boat, making sure that the boat can still float as you go out to the water. Now we got to remember there are 12 disciples plus Jesus getting into this wooden boat along with their supplies. 12 disciples, Jesus, and a bunch of supplies got into this boat and started going across. They set off towards the other side of the lake. At this point, they can look over, and it would be a clear day like this right here where they could look out and they could see the other side. And that's how the disciples knew that it was safe to cross. They would look over at the other side, they see, it's safe, we can go, it's good conditions, let's go. If there was something dangerous, they would have stayed on the shore until the danger passed. So they figure they can see the other side, it's a blue sky, we'll be fine. So they begin to sail out, and they take their time to sail because they're not really looking at the time at all. They aren't really trying to make a world record here. But we can assume they're talking to each other and they're learning from Jesus as they go along. They begin to sail across, not sensing that there's any danger coming. They figure they're going to be fine as they go from one side of the sea to the other. Now, what's interesting, though, right here is Jesus' reaction to the whole thing, the whole scene playing out. Because what does Jesus do? Jesus goes and falls asleep. Now, those of you who have been out in boats before, I have as well, one of the great things about taking a boat out to a calm ocean or a calm sea is it's nice to go out and relax. Sometimes, some of you fishermen, you go out, you put your fishing line on the side of the boat to a holder, and then you go back and you fall asleep, maybe put a bell on it to make sure if it starts ringing, time to wake up and catch some fish. But it's nice to be able to lay back, relax, as the calm waters kind of take you along the boat in the sea. It's easy to just lean back and fall asleep like you don't have a care in the world. And these guys aren't fishing right now. They don't have any work to do. They're not doing anything but traveling from point A to point B. So Jesus goes over to the front of the boat and falls asleep. But remember, while the disciples have no idea, Jesus knows what's coming. This tells us something about Jesus' demeanor. We know that Jesus knows why he wants to go to the other side. Jesus knows what's going to happen on this sea today, which makes his actions here so interesting. It shows us there is no fear in Jesus at all. Jesus knows what's going to come. He knows what's going to happen, and yet Jesus still goes to sleep. Why? Because Jesus has complete confidence, complete authority, and complete control. What's about to happen, Jesus knows he doesn't need to fear. He doesn't have any fear in him at all. He knows what's going to come, but he knows there's no reason to fear. Why? Because he's in the boat. Because he's in the boat. They're going to be just fine. And so Jesus falls asleep. And that's when this nice clear day that the disciples are sailing on all of a sudden turns for the worst. Because a giant storm came onto the Sea of Galilee. And we remember what the conditions are. So the winds come flying down from the hills and they concentrate on the water. And it creates these waves, 10, 11-foot high waves. And they go up and over the boat. And the boat's getting rocked and swayed from side to side. And the boat starts getting swamped. Water starts getting in the boat. And so there was a danger. There was water getting in the boat, and all of the men and all of the stuff in the boat are weighing it down while water is coming up into the boat, seeping in. The ship is now sinking. 12 of them plus supplies, plus Jesus in this wooden boat in this giant storm, and their boat is being swamped. Sinking in the middle of this storm right here would assuredly lead them to their doom. That's exactly what these disciples and the fishermen think, is that they've just been led to their doom. They followed Jesus out here to the middle of this sea, and now they're going to die out here on this sea. They're looking around, they're frightened. You got to think for a second about this. These men are tough men, they're fishermen. They've been fishing on this sea their entire lives. They know what this means. They know this place, and they know what is good and when a situation goes bad. They're frightened enough, they all think they're going to die. And we need to remember this storm came up all of a sudden. It's not like they could look across and see storm clouds start rolling in. They thought it was going to be safe enough to even go across to begin with. If they saw something like this rolling in, they wouldn't have gone to begin with. So we see a little bit of an interesting situation that Jesus knew was going to come. And this storm starts rolling in, and it rolls in quick. And the boat starts to sink. They think they're going to drown. They think they're going to die, and they're afraid of what's going on. These big fishermen, big guys, think they're about to die, and they're so frightened that they cry out, and they start getting hysterical. But we remember one thing. Jesus is still on the boat, still sleeping through this entire thing. And all of this, through all this storm and all of the boat rocking and it's sinking and the disciples are getting hysterical and things are going crazy, Jesus is still sleeping. The disciples, they have no idea what to do. They've lost all sense of any kind of good, solid, critical thinking at this point because they think they're going to die. So they do the one thing, the only thing they can think of. They look over and they see Jesus sleeping. So what do? They go wake up Jesus. As they think they're going to die, they go over and they look at Jesus and they say, Master, Master, we're all going to drown. This is an absolute statement. They really think they're going to drown. And they turn to their last hope, Jesus. Do something. Do something. We're all going to die. And you can see the fear in their faces as they look out on the storm, and they see the waves coming up over the boat, crashing into the boat, pushing it back and forth, and they're sitting there looking at the water coming into the boat. This is going to sink us. We're going to be put in this water without a boat in the middle of this storm with 11, 12-foot waves. And we did this because we followed Jesus out into this middle of this sea, and now we're going to die out here. But that's not how this story ends. Because Jesus is still in the boat. And Jesus has just woken up. And his demeanor shows no fear at all. See, Jesus hears their pleas. He hears the cries of, Master, Master, we're going to drown. And so Jesus got up. Now Jesus could have stayed asleep, and they would have been fine. Jesus could have done nothing, and they would have been fine. But Jesus is about to show them, teach them something here. His whole point, the reason why he went out to begin with on this day of all days, where this storm just all of a sudden decided to start coming up. And he walks out to the front of the boat step by step. And he looks out at this storm. And the disciples are looking up going, what is he doing? They go up and they look across the waves, and he rebukes the storm. He goes up to the storm and says, Storm, you're going to stop in my name. Now think about where the disciples are at for a second. They're looking up and they're going, Jesus is yelling at the storm. What is going on here? And this is not without precedence either, people, because there's a famous story that would have made its rounds around the area by this point, an ancient story about another king, Xerxes, who was trying to lead his army into Greece, was trying to get across part of the sea that wasn't cooperating with him. And so he was trying to get across the sea to get to Greece, to Macedonia, to be able to lead his armies through. The sea's not cooperating, so what does he have done? He has his men take whips and start whipping, literally whipping the sea to try to beat the sea into submission. King Xerxes, who thinks he's God in the flesh, thinks that he can get the sea to obey him by sending his men in with whips to go beat the ocean into submission. And we sit there today, and the disciples must have heard about this as well by this point, because it's a pretty infamous story. And they got to look and go, this is one of the most ridiculous things we've ever seen. Jesus is going up to the front of the boat and he's yelling at the storm. Which makes what happens so amazing here. Because Jesus speaks with this commanding voice and tells the storm to stop. And unlike King Xerxes, which the sea never cooperated for, the storm for Jesus stops. So Jesus goes out to the front of the boat, looks around the storm, tells the storm to stop, and all of a sudden the storm starts to break. Sunlight starts coming through the clouds, and the wind starts to calm down, and the clouds start to part slower and slower to the point where the storm disappears completely. And the disciples look out with Jesus, and they see that the lake is completely calm again. The lake that moments before had 11 and 12-foot waves coming up over the boat. All of a sudden, Jesus gets up, rebukes the storm, and the storm just stops. And the lake becomes calm once again. And they are safe, like it never even happened to begin with. Jesus goes up to his disciples, and he asks a simple question to them. Really the whole point of this whole trip to begin with. It was a test. It was a test for the disciples. Because he goes up to the disciples and asks them, where is your faith? What are you doing? They've seen Jesus do all these mighty works and miracles. He raised people from the dead in front of them. And all of them believe that he's someone special, that he's someone from God. And so the question has to come up, what did you think was going to happen? Did you really lack in trust that much? Jesus asks, where is your faith? Why did you not trust in me? Why did you not believe that you were going to be fine? Why did you wake me up hysterical? The question is really, disciples, why are you acting this way? Why are you doing this? There's no reason why you should be freaking out. Where is your faith? Jesus knew they were going to be fine. He knew that they wouldn't die in this storm. So much so that he knew that he went and fell asleep and slept through the good majority of the storm. The disciples who have seen Jesus raise people from the dead should have known, even though they saw the water coming in and were working to try to get the water out, should have known that it wasn't going to end like this. Should have known they were going to be fine. Instead, they freak out. And it's almost like they forget every single time that Jesus has done something amazing in front of them. What Jesus is basically asking is, have you really forgotten everything up to this point? Do you not remember who's in the boat with you? Why did they not have faith? After all of this stuff, after everything they've been through, they've seen, they had to acknowledge at one point or another that Jesus was someone different. Otherwise, they wouldn't have followed. What happened? We see at this point, the disciples, their faith wavered. They still don't completely grasp and understand who exactly Jesus is. They know Jesus is someone special, but they still don't completely get it. But what makes them different than all the others, all the Pharisees, all the people in the crowds, is that they still have the right attitude. Yeah, they might not completely get it, but we see from their reaction later, they keep following Jesus after this. They want to learn from Jesus. They want to suck in everything they can. They want to mold their lives after Jesus. He's the one they're following. So that's what makes them different from everyone else, is that they have this right attitude. But this event right here shows that they still have a very long way to go. There's a fear that comes over them, but also an amazement. Why? Because they say, who is this that commands even the winds and the water? They obey him. They still don't completely understand, but they see something here, that even the elements, even weather itself, the earth itself obeys this man right here. And so they see, even though their faith wavered at this one part, they still move forward with Jesus. So at the beginning, it's easy to say we trust in Jesus when times are good. The disciples had many times when they were with Jesus where they watched those miracles, where they watched Jesus raise people from the dead. What was different about this time? Were the disciples in any danger when Jesus raised that boy from the dead? Or when he healed people in the crowds? Were the disciples, were they in any kind of life danger? No. It's easy to look at things that Jesus does when things are going right. When things are all okay, it's easy to say, yeah, we trust in Jesus. It's a lot harder to say it when things go wrong or when things get tough. It's a lot harder to say, I trust in Jesus, when you have something on the line. When all of a sudden things get dangerous. When things get dangerous in this world, and things will get dangerous, when our faith is tested, the question is, what are you going to say? What are you going to do, and how are you going to react? There are times when we come up to dangerous situations, and our faith wavers. We're human. The disciples, their faith wavered even after post-resurrection, post-Jesus ascension. There were times where the disciples' faith wavered a little bit. On one hand, that should give us an encouragement, because if these guys who literally saw Jesus do this, their faith wavered later on, should give us a little encouragement to go, oh, okay, we still have a long way to go, but we're still on the right path. But there are times we need to remember that things are going to get difficult. Things are going to get hard in this life. Sometimes we forget all about who Jesus is. During those hard times, sometimes we tend to forget what Jesus has already done. And we forget to trust that Jesus knows what's best and that He is in control. Faith isn't an amount. We tend to look at passages like when Jesus said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And we tend to misread that passage and think to ourselves, if we have enough faith, all of these things can happen. Like faith is some kind of amount that grows, and people, it doesn't work like that. You either trust or you don't. It's an is or an isn't. I can't tell you how many people, horrible things have happened, and they've come and they've said, if I had just had enough faith, this horrible thing wouldn't have happened. And they use passages like this, but they've missed the point completely, that this faith is not an amount. It's an is or a not. You either trust or you don't. There are times when faith wavers. There are times when we start to lose trust. But faith isn't an amount. Trust isn't an amount. The disciples trusted Jesus, but that went on and off. We need to remember what faith is really all about, and where faith really starts, where trust really begins. And that really begins at the object of our trust. We remember in this passage right here, who is the object of trust? Who's in the boat? Jesus is in the boat. Jesus is the object of our trust and our faith. Jesus is whom we trust. You either trust Jesus or you don't. Now, Jesus doesn't promise easy in this life. There are going to be storms. There are going to be times where things get difficult. There are going to be times where we're tested. There are going to be times where we think all is lost. There are times where people have to give up everything for Christ. Where they sit there and they stare down the barrel of a gun and someone says, do you trust in Jesus or do you deny Him? That's about as tough as it gets. But that's really where you find out what you truly believe. Because it's easy to say we trust in Jesus when things are good, when things are easy in life. You really find out what you believe when things get tough, where you really have to put something on the line, where your life might be on the line for it. The disciples had it easy when they were following Jesus and He was doing miracles and nothing was really on the line for them. A lot more difficult when they're sitting out in the middle of a boat in the middle of a storm thinking they're going to die. Jesus doesn't promise easy. There will be times, there will be storms that come into our lives. The question is, do you trust Jesus enough that you don't get hysterical like the disciples did? Do you trust Jesus enough to know that even if you have to give your life for Him, that everything's going to work out fine? Everything's going to be okay. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, who's still in control? Jesus is still in control. No matter what happens, no matter what we have to give up in this life, no matter what difficult thing that has to happen to us, no matter what storm comes, Jesus is still in control. It doesn't matter what happens in this country. It doesn't matter what happens anywhere else in the world. It doesn't matter what happens in North Korea. Jesus is still in control. The dictators around the world, they're not in control. They might think they are, but they're not. People in this country think they might have control. They don't. There's only one being in control right now, and that's Jesus. And the question is, do you trust him enough to go through any storm that might come? Do you trust him enough to be able to give anything? And that's an is or an isn't. It's a yes or a no. It's not an amount. Do you trust him or do you not? When bad things happen, do you believe that Jesus is in control? Or is that some sort of mantra that we just say to make ourselves feel better? Do you really believe it? When we say Jesus is in control, do you know it, do you believe it, and do you act on it? Or do you act hysterical like the disciples did? Hard times are going to come. Difficult times are going to come. That's inevitable. But we know that throughout all those storms and all the difficult times in our lives, if we truly trust in Jesus, Jesus is going to be right in the boat with us. And we have nothing to fear. There's nothing we have to fear. And even if we give our lives for this, we will meet our Savior and we will have paradise with him. That's what awaits us. So if that's the case, what do we have to fear in this life? Is there any storm that's so great that all of a sudden we should lose our trust in Jesus? No. Jesus is in control. Our job is to trust in him no matter what happens. Jesus is in control, was in control yesterday, is in control today, and will be in control tomorrow. And that's the end of the story. Trust in the one who is in control. Let's pray. Father God, we thank you for what you have given to us. We thank you for the ability to be able to trust in you, what you have done for us, what you are doing for us. We thank you for the gifts that you have given to us, and we pray that you will build our confidence in you. In your name.